How does God rule the earth? With loving arms, with wisdom. It's one of those questions, though, that as Christians have seek to struggle with God's providence, how God knows and guides the future, that they've kind of, that depending on which denomination you're from, you kind of end up in an argument. And I would like to say that this way, that we're a Wesleyan denomination of Methodists. And Methodists follow Wesley's method, right? That's why we were called Methodists. But right in the tail of how does God rule the earth is really the difference in how we are slightly different from some of the other denominations. Doesn't make them wrong, it just means we focused on this. As an aside, do you know how denominations first started? Splitting and changing and becoming 35 million of them. And by the way, I've got a book in my office if you're ever interested. It is The Story of Denominations, and what it is, it's the handbook. And in a book about this thick, every page has a different denomination, some brief statement about them, where they're mainly located, what's different about them, and all those things. It was a book I got from my father, who was a church architect, who had to kind of know what was going on in the church he was walking into. You know, because you can say the wrong things. And it would be good if you're seeking to build a new building for somebody to not say those wrong things. But here's the thing about how does God rule the earth. And I need to sort of tell you something right from the beginning, that many of the changes in the denominations stem from one sort of viewpoint. Is God over there doing things and absolutely in control, or do we have freedom? That those two things, that's how that, and I would like to say that those are opposite sides of the coin. You have freedom and God knows what you're going to choose. And He works all things together for good for those called according to His purpose. Does that mean He works all things together for good for everybody? No, that's not what that means. But just because you think you're called according to His purpose does not mean somebody else isn't called according to His purpose that believes something different. I just need to get in here and sort of say that. But how do we believe that God rules in providence and is in charge of the earth? How do we know about God this way? So I'm going to start with reading from Exodus 34. So Exodus 34 in your pew Bible, I'm on page 145, and I'm going to read 10 verses. Some of it will feel sort of different, but we're going to come back to some of that as we go, okay? So let me lay the stage. The Lord told Moses to go chisel out a new set of stone tablets, that he was going to write the guides or the 10 Commandments on them again, because Moses has smashed the first set. Why did Moses smash the first set? Because he was coming down the mountain and the people were doing all the Egyptian and pagan things. And he said, ah. And he smashed them, and God's saying, we're going to do this again. So this is where we're picking up in the story. Then the Lord told Moses, chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write the same words that were on the tablets you smashed. Be ready in the morning to climb up Mount Sinai and present yourself to me on the top of the mountain. No one else may come with you. In fact, no one is to appear on the mountain, and don't let the flocks or herds graze on the mountain. So, this feels very strict, yes? Is there areas in your life that God is very strict with you? Yes.
Like a father.
Right, but very strict. I mean, very strict. Some fathers aren't particularly strict in very many places. Some would say laissez-faire, very French of us, right? But let's say this, very strict. Is there spots where God is very strict with us And we don't pay very good attention to that. Yeah. What about the places where he's very strict and we pay attention? What's the difference there? What's the difference when we pay attention to where he's strict and where we don't? Well, life goes smoother when you do this, but in our rebellion, we often only obey those things that have been pointed out as very serious to us. And so we pay better attention where we know there's a problem if we're disobedient. If we don't think there's a problem, we go ahead and be disobedient. But God's strict for a purpose. He wants us to do so. So here we are back in this thing. So Moses chiseled out the 2 tablets of stone like the first ones. Early in the morning he climbed Mount Sinai as the Lord commanded, and he carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands. And then the Lord came down in a cloud and stood there with him, and he called out his own name, Yahweh. The Lord passed in front of Moses, calling out, Yahweh, the Lord, and this is how the Lord will be as he rules the earth. Okay, are you ready for this? The God of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. I lavish unfailing love to 1,000 generations. I forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but I do not excuse the guilty. I lay the sins of the parents upon the children and grandchildren. The entire family is affected, even children to the 3rd and 4th generations. Moses immediately threw himself to the ground and worshipped. And he said, O Lord, if it is true that you have found that I have found favor with you, then please travel with us. Yes, this is a stubborn and rebellious people. But please forgive our iniquity and our sins. Claim us as your own special possession. The Lord replied, I am making a covenant with you in the presence of all your people. I will perform miracles that have never been performed anywhere on the earth or in any nation, and all the people around you will see the power of the Lord, the awesome power I will display for you. But be careful to listen to everything I command to you today. How will the Lord rule the earth? Is he separate and just sort of setting things in motion? Or is he involved?
He's involved in their lives.
He's involved. In fact, he knows what's going on, and he's full of compassion and mercy and unfailing love and faithfulness. And then he pours out blessing on those, but he doesn't excuse the guilty. Now we know for a fact that Jesus is often seen in our world today as the person that just sort of excused everything. But they often forget to read the whole context of what he says. So often Jesus is found meeting people, hearing what's going on in them, and forgiving them or saying something like this. And then he says these other words, go and sin no more. So he's forgiving, but he doesn't set it aside and excuse it. For instance, never once is Genesis 3 in the Bible. Do you know what Genesis 3 is? Genesis 3 is the fall. That's where the humans blew it. And I know the human back there blew it or whatever, and however you see that, but remember that you've made choices too, and you've blown it. So you can't just blame them. You're involved. But never once again in the Bible is Genesis 3 given as an example for why we should misbehave. It's often told that we do because of that reason, but nowhere in the Bible does God say, well, I know you're all wrong because of Genesis 3, so I'm kind of strapped with that. I can't do anything about it. God does not excuse your behavior because of Genesis 3. He asks you to look at yourself and know this. But how does he rule this way? I need to say it this way. The first example is this. It starts right in the text. He chisels out a second one. Now the story, if you look at this thing where God writes on tablets, and there's 4 or 5 spots where God writes on things. Right? He writes in the Lamb's Book of Life, which is a beginning and end story. He writes on the first set of tablets, and they come down the mountain, and nothing's going right, and so they're smashed. And so he writes again. Remember then that means the people of God, of Israel, life and family and Israel as a nation is not based on the law, but on his forgiveness and free acceptance of them. So I know that Israel sort of got caught up in the law and being legalistic and all of those things. And we were talking about it this morning a little bit in Sunday school. We talked about this, that in Malachi 3, they're doing sacrifices. But they're not doing it really correctly. They're sacrificing all the lame animals because you can't have those in your herds and all those things. And God actually says in Malachi, try offering your governors those. You try offering other humans those, and they're not buying it. It works that way in our life too. Do you know that that if you're buying lobster from Maine, the best product is not in Maine? The freshest product is in Maine, but they sell and ship the most expensive one because everybody's spending a premium. Now, the freshest apples from Washington are here, but the best apples are shipped because people are paying a premium for that. It's kind of how that goes. So how do we get here? We get here because we're offering sacrifices. Well, we're told we have to offer sacrifices, but it really doesn't matter what quality the sacrifice is. Do you hear the human rebellion going on in there? I know that we're just going through the motions here. And so God says this: you're doing wrong, and if you do what's right, why would that be held against you? Does that sound familiar? That actually sounds like what he said to Cain. Look, if you do what's right, everything's going to be accepted. But if you do what's wrong, it's not going to be accepted. Malachi 3, in the sacrificial system, where they're not sacrificing the best animals, becomes a problem. In Jesus' day, they think they fixed it. So in Jesus' day, you can't bring your own animal to sacrifice because, the priests were getting in trouble for sacrificing bad animals. And so now they've taken the court of the Gentiles and turned it into a marketplace where if you bring your lamb, even if it's perfect, the priest will find some problem with it, and you have to sell it at their prices and then buy a fancy one they've checked out. Now I'm here to tell you, same disobedience, opposite direction. They're not doing what's right. Now they've turned the house of God into a marketplace. But we're doing better sacrifices. Sorta. Do you get my point? They're making another mistake. So Jesus cleanses the temple because of this. How does he get involved with writing on things? Well, writing is a judgment and a mercy. So the 10 Commandments the first time feel like law, but they're destroyed and they're given in mercy. The second time as a guide. The next time God writes on something, he writes in Babylon, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Counted, weighed, divided up is what that means. So the king of Babylon thinks he's in control of the whole universe, and God writes on the wall and says, no, I've counted you, I've examined you, you don't measure up, and your kingdom is divided. That sounds like judgment, yes? That's judgment. But also a mercy to the people underneath that king. It's a mercy. When's the next time we have Jesus writing? We have him writing on the ground with the woman caught in adultery. Writing twice. Everybody sees their own judgment, they make their own judgment, but mercy is given. So when God writes something, it's for you, but it's also a guide, yes? There's another couple places he writes. All through the Bible, he writes his word upon your heart, which means you're accountable to it because it's in you, but it's flesh, it's alive to you. And then in Genesis, or in Revelation 2, and I love this location. This is 2:17, Revelation 2:17. This is in the letters to the churches. And the letters to the churches, each church has their own little issues. You might think that our church is perfect, but I'm telling you, it's got issues. You know, it's got issues because humans are here, and humans have issues. It doesn't matter where you go. If you find a perfect church, you can't go because then you'd bring your issues. But this is it, Pergamum. And I love this letter to Pergamum. It goes like this. I know that you live in the city where Satan has his throne. And yet you remain loyal to me and you refuse to deny and all this stuff. And he goes on to say, essentially, I have some complaints that you tolerate this bad teaching, blah, blah, blah. But I realize that where you live, you're doing the best you can. Mercy to you. Just don't lose anything else. And anyone with ears to hear must listen, and the Spirit must understand what he's saying. To everyone who is victorious, I will give some manna that has been hidden away in heaven, and I will give each one of you a white stone, and on the white stone will be engraved the new name that no one understands except for right? I'm going to give you a new name. This is the last time God writes on stone for you a new name. Now in this case, the judgments have been given, but what's the difference between the Old Testament writing of the Ten Commandments and the book of Revelation writing on a stone with a new name? What has occurred biblically that changes everything? Okay, just this Jesus, the Sunday school answer. Everybody, can you say Jesus came? Jesus came. He changes everything, right? Jesus came. I just need you to just recognize that there's two places where the throne room of God is shown in the Bible very clearly. In Isaiah 6, and when a human is brought into Isaiah 6, he hears what come out of his mouth. Woe is me. I'm a sinful man and a sinful people, and I've seen the Lord, and I'm coming undone. The next time we see the throne room of heaven, you hear the angels say, worthy, worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Jesus came. He changes everything. How does he change everything? He actually changes everything because he takes the sin of the world. He's full of unfailing love and forgiveness for us. How does God rule the world? How does God providence see the world and all of that stuff? He's with you. He's for you. He's taking your concerns upon himself. And Exodus 3 or 34 talks about that long in advance. And you might say, well, he was different for Israel from other people. No. If you go to Amos, Amos literally says, do you think you're special? Yes, you're special because God gave you an Exodus. But he's also given Exoduses to these other countries who were slaves. In fact, one of the ones that he removed from the promised land had been given an Exodus from somebody else and not kept track. So thus, when we get to the end of Genesis 34, and it says, go with, if we found favor in your eyes, Lord, go with us everywhere we go. Yes, I will go everywhere with you, but you be careful to do what I say. You be careful to not be stiff-necked, to pay attention to what I've said and why I've said it, because I'm full of grace and mercy and unfailing love to multiple generations, but I don't excuse the spots where you go, hey, maybe God doesn't really care here. He doesn't excuse those spots in your life. Have you ever done that had that thought in your head where you said to yourself, well, maybe God doesn't think this is such a big deal, I'll just go ahead and do it anyway. Have you ever done that? You don't raise your hand. That is not a public admission thing. But all of you who are saying, no, I've never done that, you're wrong. You have. I have too. God cares because he has a way in the world that he rules, and he wants his people to do it within his character. So the first thing in our story is that God's writing is both judgment and mercy. It corrects us, and it teaches us, and it guides us, and it provides our new future. Yes? The second thing is this. We prayed it over Fran. Now, I've been told when you're sitting in the chair and the Lord's Prayer comes over you, that's a different moment in prayer. Is that true? That when you're sitting down here in this chair, I think, Bev, we prayed over you once and you came out and said the Lord's Prayer is enfolding. But what is the Lord's Prayer? It says, on earth as it is in heaven. God's will is absolutely being followed in heaven. And what his goal is for it to be on earth as it is in heaven. And so he always lives. This is it, Hebrews 7:25. Do you know, Jesus always lives to make intercession for you. That it's not his presence in the throne room is there, so intercession's been made once, and then it doesn't need to happen again. That whenever we and our hearts begin to feel guilty, Jesus is making intercession from the throne room for us. God doesn't need to be reminded that Jesus has paid the price. Jesus is God. God knows. He remembers the cross. But Jesus always lives forever in the throne room now. But that's sort of hard to get your grasp around. But when the time was just right, so how do we get infinity and back to us? When the time was just right, he came and sacrificed himself for us at just the right moment. Not infinity. It wasn't that he was just in heaven and he didn't, but he's in heaven and he was on earth very specifically for us. It's personal to God. It's personal. It's not just redemptive. It's not just direction. It's personal. Now, what do we do with this? God always knows what you're going to do, and you always have the right to do whatever you want. How do you fix that? Well, you have to understand that there's some definitions that we kind of get wrong. We start off with the world is good, so therefore it must be good, and so nothing must be wrong with it. But because it's good, or very good, as he says in the creation narrative, it's very good. But good to us means shiny and perfect. But what if good means to God does the task it was meant for? Well, not just rewarded. She says you get rewarded, but good. My car is good when it does the things it was supposed to do, but when it breaks down, it is no longer good. Is that correct? The earth hasn't broken down like my cars have broken down. God doesn't have to pull the earth over on the side of the road and change flat tires every so often to fix it. The earth is good and it is doing what it was meant to do. Does that mean there are things wrong on earth? Yes. Humans are here. We had this conversation. Didn't we? We had this conversation. Something about a perfect place and not a perfect because humans are here. But the earth is doing what it was meant to do, which means it's here to mature us. That's what it's doing. But it's also, God isn't after robots or just blind obedience. He's after this personal relationship with his people and love, and you can't force love. It's not love then. Well, that's not true. Okay, so she said you can't force anything. It's not true. People have been forced to do lots of things or to pay the price, but it's always decisions. But you can't love. You can force slaves to do things, but they don't love out of it. They call that Stockholm syndrome when it starts to show that when when you fall in love with your captors. But here it is. You're always free. And how do we know this? This is the spot where the denominations come into play. Do you know that those who believe that God sacrificed himself for people, but only the people who believe? They spend a lot of time on providence. Have you heard this story that God knows who's going to be saved, and he sacrificed Jesus for them only, and those that aren't going to be saved, Jesus wasn't sacrificed for those. Have you heard that story? In churches? Yes. That is a focus that some denominations, look, we have things wrong, and Jesus is going to save us, and where our error occurs isn't as big a deal to God as it is to us. Because we start saying, well, you don't believe correctly, so you're out, and all those things. But God says, well, none of you believe correctly, and you're going to do it my way anyway. So remember that he's in charge. But we start to come onto this thing, and I've talked about this before, that in some primitive churches and primitive theological churches, they would talk about two seeds of faith, that you are born with a seed of faith or born with a seed of not faith. And no amount of evangelism and no amount of Sunday school and nothing will have anything to do with it. If you're going to be saved, you're going to be saved, and there's nothing you can do about it. God will make that happen. And if you're not going to be saved, there's not a darn thing you can do about it. You will not be saved. You are created for destruction, or you're created for heaven. But how do we get there theologically? So I'm going to speak a little mercy here for that viewpoint, okay? Because that is paying attention to God's foreknowledge at the expense of freedom of the humans that he allows. And because God foreknew everything, the concern of those denominations often is that the cross is 100% efficient, that the cross does every single thing it was meant to do and nothing it wasn't meant to do. It's 100% efficient. It is not like our air conditioners, right? It does every single thing it meant to do and not. And if it meant to do it, and you start to say that the cross saves everybody that was meant to be saved, then you easily get to this location where the cross only does what it was meant to do, and it doesn't do, and so it wasn't for the people who didn't accept it. But that doesn't match Exodus 34. I'm gracious and long-suffering and forgiving and not willing that any should perish, all of those things. And so if we look at the cross as 100% efficient, it does every single thing it was meant to do, which I believe, and John Wesley believed, and the Methodists believe, means that everybody can be saved, and that it made a way for everyone to be saved. It made a way for God to come live in us and to go everywhere to ask him to go everywhere with us, and then to have us say, and be careful to follow what he says. Exodus 34, right there. But Jesus died for our sins so that we could be saved, and made a way that anybody should accept that path. The cross, 100% efficient, made the way open to everybody. That's the Wesleyan theology of the cross. That there weren't people made for destruction, they chose destruction. And that God wasn't interested in any of them perishing. And in that way, you get the Wesleyan sort of thoughts where the gates of heaven are not locked against the wrong people entering. The gates of hell have been locked by the people that don't want to be saved. I don't want to hear that message. And that makes sense of what you hear when you talk to people. Why are these people talking to me about Jesus like I need him or something? They're locking the gates of their hearts against the message. And God will let you make any bad decision you want to make and experience the cost. Because as Jesus says, go and sin no more. Or, I ask in Moses' words this. How about this? If you find us pleasing, Lord, go with us everywhere. I will go with you. You be careful to follow what I say. Those are Old Testament and New Testament ways of saying the exact same thing, aren't they? Go and sin no more. Follow my instruction. Please go with me. The Spirit of the Lord is upon you and in you. How does the Lord rule the universe? He is full of unfailing love and mercy, and at just the right moment, solve the problem we couldn't solve. There's so much more. But I don't think we need to hear more today. I think we need to think about that. Would you pray with me? Dear Jesus, we are so grateful for that moment when you very specifically entered time and you took all of the sins, not just of the world, but of me and everybody in this room. You took all of those on yourself, and all we need to do is yet accept those and be careful to follow your commands. Lord, move in our hearts that we would do that we would worship you, that like Moses, we would fall on our face and always remember to not be stiff-necked, but to take your mercy and grace as a chance to worship. Amen.